Before you can understand how to respond when an empath comes back, you have to understand why they came back in the first place. Most people get this wrong. They assume that if someone returns, it must mean they regret leaving. Or they assume it means they want another chance. Sometimes that's true, but often, that's not what's happening at all. Human behavior is rarely as simple as it appears on the surface. People tell themselves stories about why others leave and why they return, but those stories are usually filtered through emotion. Hurt people tend to create explanations that protect their pride. They tell themselves, they came back because they realized I was the best thing they ever had. Maybe, but maybe not. An empath operates differently than most people. Their decisions are often driven by emotional perception rather than logic alone. They pay attention to feelings, patterns, and unspoken truths. While other people may move on by suppressing emotions, an empath tends to process them. That means when they walk away from a relationship, friendship, or connection, they don't always leave with complete certainty. Sometimes they leave because staying has become too painful. Sometimes they leave because they are overwhelmed. Sometimes they leave because they have spent so much time understanding everyone else that they temporarily lose sight of themselves. And that creates something interesting. Distance has a way of changing perception. When you're inside a situation, your judgment is often clouded by emotion. You're reacting rather than observing. But once enough time passes, the emotional fog begins to clear. What seemed confusing starts making sense. What seemed urgent becomes less important. What seemed impossible suddenly looks manageable. This is why some empaths return. Not because they suddenly became different people overnight, not because they were struck by some dramatic realization, but because time gave them perspective. Perspective is one of the most powerful psychological forces in human behavior. It allows people to reevaluate experiences without the distortion of immediate emotion. The empath who returns may not be returning to rekindle a relationship. They may be returning to understand it. That distinction matters. Many people hear from someone after months or years and immediately interpret it as an invitation. They think the return itself is the message. But often the return is simply the beginning of a conversation that was never fully completed in the person's mind. The empath may be seeking clarity. They may be seeking truth. They may be seeking peace. And those are not the same as seeking reconciliation. One of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming every return carries the same intention. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We want certainty. We want simple explanations. We want clear categories. Friend or enemy, stay or leave, love or indifference. Reality is rarely that clean. An empath may come back because they finally understand something they couldn't see before. They may recognize patterns they ignored. They may realize that some of the pain they blamed on another person actually came from wounds they carried long before the relationship began. Growth often produces curiosity. And curiosity often leads people back to places they once left. Think about that. Some people return because they miss the connection. Some return because they miss the familiarity. Some return because they miss who they were when they were with you. And some return simply because their conscience requires them to finish a chapter properly. The mature response is not to assume. The mature response is to observe. This is where emotional intelligence separates itself from emotional reaction. Most people are so focused on what they want the return to mean that they never take time to discover what it actually means. They become attached to a narrative before gathering evidence, and once emotion takes control, objectivity disappears. The strongest person in the room is usually the one who can tolerate uncertainty long enough to see reality clearly. If an empath comes back, resist the urge to immediately celebrate. Resist the urge to immediately reject. Resist the urge to turn the situation into a victory or a revenge fantasy. Instead, become curious. Ask yourself a better question. Not, why did they leave? Not even, why did they come back? Ask, what truth became visible to them that wasn't visible before? Because that question moves you beyond ego and into understanding. And understanding is where wisdom begins. The people who navigate these situations best are not the people with the quickest reactions. They are the people with the deepest awareness. They recognize that every return carries a story, and until that story is understood, Every assumption is simply a guess disguised as certainty. When an empath comes back, don't focus on what their return means for your future. First, understand what it reveals about the past, because the person who understands the reason for the return will always make a better decision than the person who merely reacts to it. And that's the lesson worth remembering. When someone returns, the return itself is not the message. Understanding why they returned is. Before we go any further, there's something important that has to be addressed. Once an empath comes back, the biggest danger isn't what they might do. The biggest danger is what you might do. Most people think the challenge is figuring out whether the empath is sincere. But psychologically speaking, that's not the first challenge. The first challenge is managing your own emotional reaction. Because when someone returns after leaving, they don't just bring their presence back into your life. They bring back every emotion attached to their absence. Old memories return. Old disappointments return. Old hopes return. Old questions return. And if you're not careful, you'll make a decision based on those emotions rather than the reality standing in front of you. This is where most people make a critical mistake. They immediately move to one of two extremes. The first extreme is emotional surrender. The moment the empath returns, they open the door completely. They assume the return itself is proof of change. They interpret the contact as validation. Suddenly, all the pain, confusion, and unresolved issues are pushed aside because they're so focused on the possibility of restoring what was lost. The second extreme is emotional retaliation. This is the person who has spent weeks, months, or years imagining this moment. They rehearsed speeches in their head. They imagined finally having power. They imagined the satisfaction of rejecting someone who once rejected them. So when the empath returns, they don't respond from wisdom. They respond from accumulated resentment. On the surface, these two reactions look completely different. One welcomes, one rejects. But psychologically, they're driven by the same force. Emotion is in control. That's the part most people miss. Whether you instantly embrace someone or instantly push them away, you're still allowing the past to dictate your behavior. You're reacting instead of evaluating. And reaction is rarely a sign of strength. Reaction is often evidence that something unresolved is still operating beneath the surface. Think about how emotional wounds work. They don't simply disappear because time passes. They remain active until they are understood. That's why a single text message from someone you haven't spoken to in years can instantly change your mood. It's not because of the message itself. It's because the message touched something that was never fully processed. The empath's return becomes a mirror, and what you see in that mirror matters. Do you see calm curiosity, or do you see emotional urgency? Do you feel the need to immediately decide? Do you feel compelled to prove something? Do you feel a desire to punish, impress, persuade, or protect yourself? Those impulses reveal far more about your internal state than they reveal about the person who returned. One of the most useful principles in psychology is understanding that emotional intensity often distorts perception. The stronger the emotional charge, the more likely you are to misinterpret what's happening. You begin seeing what you fear or what you hope instead of what actually exists. This is why the first question should never be, should I take them back? That question is premature. It assumes the purpose of the interaction is already known. Instead, ask a better question. Why are they here now? Not why were they here before? Not what happened 6 months ago. Why now? Timing reveals motivation. Timing reveals context. Timing reveals information that emotion tends to overlook. A person who has genuinely grown often communicates differently than a person who is simply lonely. A person seeking understanding behaves differently than a person seeking validation. A person pursuing closure operates differently than someone attempting to recreate the past. But you'll never notice those differences if you've already made up your mind. This is where emotional discipline becomes essential. Discipline isn't about suppressing your feelings. It's about refusing to let your feelings make decisions on your behalf. You can acknowledge disappointment without becoming bitter. You can acknowledge affection without becoming vulnerable to manipulation. You can acknowledge curiosity without abandoning caution. That balance is where maturity lives. Unfortunately, many people never reach that point because they're obsessed with certainty. They want immediate answers. They want guarantees. They want to know whether this person belongs in their future before their Zuul, why they're standing in their present. Life doesn't work that way. Human beings are complicated. Relationships are complicated. And meaningful decisions require observation before action. This is why the most emotionally intelligent response is often the least dramatic one. It's not a grand reunion. It's not a cold rejection. It's a pause, a deliberate moment of observation, a willingness to gather information before assigning meaning. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Because once emotion settles, patterns become visible. Words become easier to evaluate. Intentions become easier to recognize. And most importantly, you become capable of making a decision based on reality instead of emotional momentum. The people who consistently make the best decisions in relationships are not necessarily the smartest people. They're the people who can remain emotionally neutral long enough to see clearly. That's a rare skill. And it's the skill that protects you from repeating old mistakes. So when an empath comes back, don't rush toward them and don't rush away from them. Stay still long enough to understand what you're actually looking at. Because the moment you stop reacting and start observing, you gain something far more valuable than control over them. You gain control over yourself. And the person who masters their response will always be more powerful than the person who is controlled by it. Once you've resisted the urge to react emotionally, and you've given yourself enough space to observe what's actually happening, the next question becomes incredibly important. What is the empath really looking for? Most people assume they already know the answer. They assume the empath is looking for another chance. They assume they're looking for forgiveness. They assume they're looking for a relationship, a friendship, or some form of emotional reunion. But human behavior is rarely driven by a single motive. And empaths, perhaps more than most people, tend to operate from layers of emotional awareness that aren't always obvious on the surface. This is where understanding becomes more valuable than assumption. One of the defining characteristics of an empath is that they are constantly reading beneath the words. While many people focus on what is being said, empaths are often paying attention to what isn't being said. They notice inconsistencies. They notice emotional tension. They notice when someone's actions and words don't align. In many ways, an empath is less interested in your explanation than they are in your authenticity. That's a distinction worth understanding. Most people believe communication is about exchanging information. An empath often experiences communication as an exchange of emotional truth. They are listening for sincerity. They are paying attention to emotional congruence. They want to know whether the person standing in front of them is genuine or simply performing a version of themselves. And this is often what they're evaluating when they return. Not whether the connection can be restored, not whether the past can be recreated, but whether something real exists beneath the surface. The mistake many people make is assuming that the empath has returned to revisit the past. In reality, they are often examining the present. Think about that carefully. When an empath reconnects, they aren't necessarily looking at who you were. They're looking at who you are now. They're asking questions that may never be spoken aloud. Have you changed? Have I changed? Do the same problems still exist? Has growth actually occurred? Are we both seeing reality more clearly than we did before? These are not questions of romance alone. These are questions of human development. Because growth changes perception. A person who has genuinely evolved doesn't evaluate relationships the same way they once did. Their priorities shift. Their standards change. Their understanding deepens. And the empath who returns is often measuring that transformation, consciously or unconsciously. This is why superficial performances rarely work. You can impress someone for an afternoon. You can create a polished image. You can say all the right words. But authentic growth has a consistency that performance can never fully imitate. Empaths are often highly sensitive to that difference. They can feel when someone is trying to convince them. They can feel when someone is trying to manipulate perception. And they can usually sense when a person is speaking from genuine understanding rather than rehearsed self-presentation. That doesn't mean empaths are magical. It doesn't mean they're always correct. It simply means they've spent much of their lives paying attention to emotional patterns that other people ignore. And that's why authenticity matters so much. What's interesting is that many people become so focused on convincing the empath of their growth that they accidentally reveal the opposite. The need to prove yourself often comes from insecurity. The need to persuade often comes from fear. The need to control someone's perception often signals that you're that you're still dependent on their validation. A truly transformed person doesn't need to advertise their transformation. Their behavior does the talking. Their emotional stability does the talking. Their boundaries do the talking. Their self-respect does the talking. And that's what an empath tends to notice. This is also why many reconnecting conversations feel different than people expect. The discussion often has less to do with the relationship itself and more to do with personal evolution. The past becomes a reference point rather than the main subject. The real question becomes, who have we become since then? That's a powerful question because it shifts the focus away from blame. Blame keeps people trapped. Growth moves people forward. When two people meet again after time apart, they're not just comparing memories, they're comparing levels of awareness. They're comparing lessons learned. They're comparing the versions of themselves that exist today. And sometimes what they discover is surprising. Sometimes they realize the connection still has value. Sometimes they realize they've outgrown it completely. Sometimes they discover that what they missed wasn't the person at all. It was a feeling, a chapter, or a version of themselves associated with that period of life. This is why patience matters. You cannot understand someone's intentions by rushing to conclusions. You cannot understand someone's motivations through assumptions. And you certainly cannot make wise decisions if you tame, more focused on getting the answer you want than discovering the truth. The empath who returns is often searching for authenticity more than comfort. They're looking for evidence that what they feel aligns with what is real. They're evaluating whether growth has occurred, whether truth is present, and whether the connection reflects who both people are now rather than who they used to be. And that's why your task isn't to impress them. Your task isn't to convince them. Your task isn't even to win them back or push them away. Your task is to be honest enough to see the situation clearly. Because when authenticity replaces performance, truth becomes visible. And once truth becomes visible, the right decision usually reveals itself. And that's the lesson worth carrying forward. People don't return to discover who you pretended to become. They return to discover who you truly are. At this point, we've explored why an empath might come back. We've examined the emotional mistakes people make when that happens. And we've looked at what an empath is often searching for beneath the surface. Now we arrive at the part that most people focus on from the very beginning. What if you've listened, observed, reflected, and ultimately decided that the answer is no? What if you've genuinely concluded that reopening the connection is not the right decision? This is where character reveals itself. Because anyone can reject someone from a place of anger. Anyone can walk away when resentment is fueling the decision. The real challenge is rejecting someone when you no longer hate them, when you no longer need revenge, and when you've reached enough clarity to see them as a human being rather than a villain. That is a very different kind of strength. Most people misunderstand rejection. They treat it as an opportunity to balance emotional accounts. They believe that if they were hurt in the past, they now have permission to return that pain. They view the moment as justice. Psychologically, this is a fascinating mistake, because revenge often disguises itself as closure. A person tells themselves they're finally standing up for themselves, but what they're actually doing is remaining emotionally attached to an old wound. Their actions are still being dictated by the past. Their emotions are still being controlled by someone who isn't even present anymore. That's not freedom. That's dependency, wearing a different mask. One of the clearest signs that a wound has healed is that you no longer feel compelled to make someone suffer in order to feel whole. Think about that. If someone returns and your first instinct is to punish them, humiliate them, embarrass them, or make them experience what you experienced, then the relationship may be over, but the emotional attachment is still alive. The opposite of attachment is not hatred. The opposite of attachment is peace. And peace changes how you reject people. A peaceful person doesn't need a dramatic speech. They don't need to prove a point. They don't need to create emotional damage. They simply communicate the truth. This is where maturity separates itself from emotional reactivity. Many people believe a rejection needs to be harsh in order to be strong. But harshness and strength are not the same thing. In fact, harshness is often evidence of unresolved emotion. The calmer a person becomes, the less interested they are in theatrics. A mature rejection is remarkably simple. It acknowledges reality. It respects boundaries. And it avoids unnecessary cruelty. Notice what it doesn't do. It doesn't reopen every old argument. It doesn't recite a list of past mistakes. It doesn't transform the conversation into a courtroom where someone must be found guilty. Why? Because the purpose of a healthy rejection is not to rewrite history. The purpose is to define the future. That's a crucial distinction. Many people become trapped because they're trying to win an argument that ended years ago. They think if they can finally explain everything perfectly, they'll feel complete. But closure rarely comes from saying more. Often, closure comes from deciding that no further explanation is required. This becomes especially important when dealing with an empath. Empaths are often highly responsive to emotional sincerity. If your rejection is loaded with bitterness, sarcasm, or hidden hostility, they will likely sense it immediately. And even if they don't say anything, the interaction becomes contaminated by emotions that no longer serve either person. But when your response is grounded in clarity, something different happens. You create a clean ending. You communicate that you've reflected on the situation. You communicate that your decision isn't driven by impulse. You communicate that you've chosen your path deliberately. And that matters. Because there is a profound difference between rejecting someone because you've hurt and rejecting someone because you've grown. One is reactive. The other is intentional. Intentional decisions tend to age well. Reactive decisions often become future regrets. This is why emotional discipline remains so important throughout this entire process. The temptation to be dramatic can be surprisingly strong. The ego loves moments of perceived power. It enjoys imagining the perfect comeback. It enjoys fantasies of making someone realize what they lost. But genuine confidence doesn't require an audience. A person who truly knows their worth doesn't need to advertise it. They don't need validation through rejection. They don't need to create a lesson for someone else. Their peace is already intact. And because their peace is intact, their boundaries become effortless. This is what many people fail to understand about boundaries. Boundaries are not walls built out of anger. Boundaries are decisions built out of self-respect. Anger says, I want you to feel what I felt. Self-respect says, I know what is healthy for me moving forward. Those are completely different motivations. And one of them creates freedom while the other creates endless cycles of emotional repetition. If you've decided the connection should not continue, then say so honestly. Say so respectfully. Say so clearly. Don't leave false hope. Don't play games. Don't keep the door half open simply because you enjoy the attention. That isn't kindness. It's confusion. The most compassionate rejection is often the clearest one, because clarity allows both people to move forward. And ultimately, that's what this moment is really about. It's not about proving who was right. It's not about settling old scores. It's not about demonstrating power. It's about demonstrating wisdom. Because anyone can close a door in anger. Very few people can close a door with respect. And that's the challenge worth accepting. If you must reject someone, do it in a way that reflects the person you've become, not the pain you've survived. As we reach the end of this discussion, we arrive at what may be the most important lesson of all. It's a lesson that most people don't learn until they've spent years repeating the same emotional patterns, revisiting the same disappointments, and searching for answers that never seem to arrive. The lesson is simple, but it is not easy. Boundaries are stronger than closure. At first, that statement sounds almost contradictory. After all, modern culture is obsessed with closure. People talk about it constantly. They believe every painful experience needs a final conversation. Every heartbreak needs a perfect explanation. Every unresolved chapter needs one last meeting, one last text, one last opportunity to say everything that was left unsaid. The problem is that life rarely works that way. Human beings are not mathematical equations. Relationships do not always end with clear conclusions. Sometimes people leave questions unanswered. Sometimes misunderstandings remain. Sometimes you never receive the apology you think you deserve. Sometimes the explanation you desperately want never comes. And yet people continue to build their emotional future around the hope that one day they will finally receive that missing piece. This creates a dangerous illusion. The illusion is that peace exists somewhere outside of you, that if the right words are spoken, you'll finally move on. That if the other person understands your pain, you'll finally feel complete. That if you can just get one more conversation, everything will make sense. But psychological maturity begins when you recognize a difficult truth. Closure is often not something you receive. It's something you create. Think about how much energy people spend waiting for another person to resolve emotions that only they can resolve. They wait for validation. They wait for acknowledgement. They wait for understanding. In some cases, they wait for years. Meanwhile, life continues moving forward. The future remains on hold because the mind is still negotiating with the past. This is where boundaries become so powerful. A boundary does something closure often cannot do. It creates certainty. Not certainty about another person, certainty about yourself. And that's an important distinction. You may never fully understand why someone made certain choices. You may never know their complete motivations. You may never receive all the answers you seek, but you can decide what is acceptable in your life moving forward. That decision belongs entirely to you. One of the reasons people struggle with boundaries is because they confuse them with punishment. They assume setting a boundary means being cold, unforgiving, or emotionally detached. In reality, healthy boundaries are acts of self-respect. A boundary doesn't say, "You are a bad person." A boundary says, "I have decided what aligns with my well-being." That's a completely different mindset. And when an empath comes back into your life, this distinction becomes especially important. Because empaths often trigger compassion. You remember the good moments. You remember the connection. You remember the vulnerability that once existed. And suddenly, the boundary you've worked so hard to build begins to feel uncomfortable. Many people mistake that discomfort for a sign that the boundary is wrong. It's not. Growth often feels uncomfortable because it requires you to choose long-term peace over short-term emotional relief. The desire to reopen old chapters isn't always a sign of wisdom. Sometimes it's simply a desire to escape uncertainty. But boundaries ask something more mature of us. They ask us to tolerate uncertainty without abandoning ourselves. That's a rare skill. Most people are willing to sacrifice clarity in exchange for temporary comfort. They will reopen situations they know are unhealthy because familiarity feels safer than the unknown. Yet every meaningful transformation in life requires the courage to leave familiar territory. This is where another important realization emerges. Love and compatibility are not the same thing. Many people spend years confusing the two. You can care deeply about someone and still recognize that they do not belong in your future. You can respect someone and still maintain distance. You can appreciate what a connection taught you without recreating that connection. These truths are difficult because they challenge the simplistic stories people tell themselves. We want relationships to fit into clean categories. If there was love, surely there should be a future. If there was connection, surely there should be reconciliation. But reality is more nuanced. Sometimes a person enters your life to teach you something. Sometimes they arrive to reveal a weakness, a pattern, or a lesson. And once that lesson has been learned, the purpose of the connection has been fulfilled. That doesn't diminish its value. In many cases, it increases it. Because now the relationship becomes part of your growth, rather than part of your ongoing struggle. This is why the strongest people are not necessarily those who hold on the longest. Often, they are the people who know when to let go with gratitude rather than resentment. They understand that preserving peace is more important than preserving potential. They understand that every open door carries a cost. And they understand that not every chapter needs to be reopened simply because it once mattered. When an empath comes back, remember everything we've discussed. Understand the reason for the return. Resist emotional reactions. Look for authenticity. Respond with clarity rather than bitterness. But above all, trust the boundaries you've built through experience. Because boundaries are not barriers to healing. They are evidence that healing has already begun. And perhaps that's the final truth worth carrying with you. Real closure doesn't come when someone finally explains the past. It comes when you respect yourself enough to protect your future.